Story 1. I am not sure I understand. Can someone gently explain what this means? Edit. Thank you, everybody. I hate this nightmare country. Story 2. The founders intentionally gave limited power to the presidency, and the Supreme Court was almost an afterthought. Their expectation was that the majority of the power would be vested in Congress, where the people had direct representation. If we want to fix our rapidly disintegrating system, it requires Congress to do their job. Story 3. It means that there will be have states and have-not states. Ironically, the have-not states are going to end up being the ones who gave us all this in the first place. Story 4. Things are going to get worse, then get violent before they ever get better, if they do get better. Story 5. There is a ton of misinformation in this thread about what the ruling does. The ruling limits injunctions to parties named in the specific case. For example, if I sue, the injunction only applies to me. Most of these larger suits are done by state attorneys general on behalf of their state. For example, if the New York Attorney General makes a case, the injunction would apply to everyone in New York. Multiple state attorneys general can sign onto one case to have the injunction cover multiple states. The Supreme Court has also said you can do injunctions on classes. If you have ever heard of a class action lawsuit, it is the same idea. You can have someone represent everyone in a class who are all affected the same way. There are two most likely outcomes from this. First, injunctions against illegal federal overreach will depend on if your state attorney general joins the lawsuit to stop it. For example, an illegal executive order targeting guns could stay in effect in Massachusetts, but not in Texas if the Massachusetts Attorney General does not sue to stop it, but the Texas Attorney General does. What state you live in and what party your Attorney General is from is about to matter a lot. Most likely, class lawsuits against these are about to become the norm, which throws up extra costs and procedural hurdles for anyone looking to stop government abuse and illegal actions by the government or anyone you are looking to sue. Story 6. Listen, I fully support the argument that nationwide injunctions are an overstep of the courts. The change needs to allow these cases to percolate through the courts. However, you cannot destroy a pillar of our checks and balances system without having a solid plan in place to solve the problem. Currently, our only check on unlawful executive orders is nationwide injunctions. Story 7. It does not matter what my thoughts are. The United States will continue its slide to authoritarianism whether I am outraged or I approve. Actions matter. Story 8. If you want to blame anyone, blame Congress. Slowly, over decades, they have been transferring their power to the president because they do not want to be accountable for their votes. They want to blame the president when things get difficult. If you think the president has too much power, it is because we allowed the federal government to grow into an untamable giant. Story 9. It is a further erosion of the checks and balances the government was founded on. Republicans in Congress are happy to let the executive branch do whatever it wants, so the courts are the only counter to executive overreach. I imagine the Supreme Court will continue to make rulings that favor an authoritarian executive branch. Story 10. From my limited understanding, it is going to increase tensions between the state and federal government because we will not be able to challenge federal authority on a legal basis as we have before. If I am correct, we are being pushed to a boiling point. I fear that, as my great-aunt pointed out, if we do not do something to maintain our checks and balances and remove this group of tyrannical politicians, we may soon face a rebellion. Story 11. Time for Democratic-leaning states to go wild and flood the courts with regional rulings that upset the political right. Story 12. The United States is on a fast track to white Christian nationalism. Recall when Donald Trump was asked about his oath to uphold the Constitution. He answered by saying that he was not sure and that he had lawyers to answer those questions. Donald Trump will not be around forever, but behind him we have J.D. Vance, a pawn of Peter Thiel, then House Speaker Mike Johnson, who has openly said that he follows God's law and not the Constitution. The Trump-controlled Congress has become totally complicit with Donald Trump. They have handed all of their power and oversight to him, and they did it willfully. Those who raise a voice of dissent are quickly threatened until they comply or are removed. We now see initiatives to end the separation of church and state. Religious schools are receiving tax dollars to push their agenda. crippling the public school system. Immigrants as well as United States citizens are being swept up by masked men and taken from family members without due process. Freedoms are being eroded every day. As Edward R. Murrow would say, "Good night and good luck." Story 13 has not changed one bit. We have lost this country. My only interest is to see who ends up liberating us in the future and what that life will be like. Story 14. Just ask the Supreme Court of the United States if the president can delay elections because that is where we are headed. Just get it over with. Story 15. The Supreme Court has opened Pandora's box. It will now be possible for any future president, through executive action alone, to remove any right that Americans have in the Constitution. Enjoy free speech? Only if the president allows it. Enjoy your Second Amendment rights to carry firearms? Only if the president allows it. Former President Donald Trump and the Republican Party may be celebrating today, but this is going to have serious consequences for them. Story 16. I think politics aside, this is one of the worst decisions the court has made. Liberal presidents have been burdened by having to follow lower court injunctions. Judge shopping is a problem affecting both parties, but it is part of the Constitution. This elevates the office of the presidency to be above the courts, except for the Supreme Court. In the future, presidents will rule entirely by executive order. This is another terrible decision by a historically bad set of justices. Story 17. The Constitution will continue to be cast aside for the whims of a dictator until the people take their country back by force. I have little faith this will happen. Story 18. I think that every ruling like this takes us one step toward authoritarianism or civil war, either of which could result in the end of the United States of America as we know it. It breaks my heart and makes me very anxious for my future. Story 19. Many Americans ignore what has happened around the world when other countries, sometimes at the behest of the United States, have gone through this exact scenario. Many are still in denial and cling to the idea of the midterm elections and the next election. There will not be another free and fair federal election. I predict it will follow a model similar to Vladimir Putin's, where there will be performative elections in which either Donald Trump or his successors are continually elected with a mysteriously consistent majority. They will keep feeding on liberal outrage, blaming non-voters or other targets while engineering false results. By the time most Americans finally accept that the electoral system is now an illusion, it will be years too late. We are already too late to convict Donald Trump and take the many steps that could have stopped this. The United States is a Christo-fascist state. The sooner people see and accept this, the better. Then they can either flee the most impacted regions or begin organizing real resistance through radical unions. Countless people have been warning about this for the past decade and were dismissed as fear-mongering leftists, rather than heeding political science and world history. The United States is a dying empire, and nothing will ever be the same. Story 20. Well, we cannot accurately describe it as the United States of America anymore. It is just the States of America now. Story 21. The president can issue an executive order. Federal courts cannot issue nationwide injunctions. The only entity that can stop the executive order is the Supreme Court. The conservative majority is more than willing to ignore the Constitution and allow many unconstitutional orders from the president. This resembles an authoritarian dictator situation. The people who enabled this are satisfied because they are getting what they want from the government right now. However, wielding uncontrollable power means they can and eventually will come for something important to you. You will have no way to stop them, and you will feel like your freedoms have been taken away because they have. It took just a little over 10 years to undo democracy. Story 22. For the court to do something this brazen shows exactly what they believe. Either Democrats will not use this power even if they win, or more likely, Democrats will not win again and will never get the chance. We are defeated. Rest in peace. Story 23. Donald Trump is now regarded as the supreme leader of every American, and we have no rights except those that Donald Trump chooses not to violate. Congratulations, America, for voting for this. We deserve everything that will come from this era of lawlessness, corruption, and misery. Story 24. I think that when the Democratic Party gets back in power and a decree is signed to allow abortion nationwide, you will be truly grateful that a single nominee in a rural area of Georgia cannot just say no and block it for everyone. Story 25. Nationwide injunctions started in the 2000s and have become politically weaponized primarily by the Republican Party. The Supreme Court ruling requires higher burdens of proof and aims to prevent forum shopping in red and blue states. The problem is that Congress is ineffective. The parties have used judges to transfer political costs away when opposing agendas. At the same time, a nation cannot function when every judge effectively has the power of a veto to stop the work of more than 15 million federal and state employees. Some level of multi-person vote is needed to prevent forum shopping. Story 26. Boy, I really hate being right. If you did not know this was going to happen when you voted for Donald Trump, you should really be taking a hard look at where you get your information. Expect a lot more protests and a lot more military presence in the streets. Donald Trump version 2. Everyone. Story 27. I predict conservative groups will strongly object and blame liberal groups when a conservative judge cannot impose a nationwide injunction. Story 28. My thoughts and predictions are too depressing, so I will go with my hopes. I hope we all get to blow off some steam like the people of Milan did in 1945. Story 29. People in denial will pretend that nothing is getting worse. People in positions of authority will seize more power. People without authority will be pushed into a smaller corner. Story 30. America ended when their coup was completed. The Supreme Court of the United States will be surprised to learn they are also not needed in our new Christian fascist government, which they helped create. We deserve nothing but our eventual collapse. Story 31. We have 12 district court systems, so 12 different constitutions. 12 districts like in the Hunger Games. Story 32. This next birthday for the United States will be its funeral. Democracy is dead in America. We are now a fascist, authoritarian oligarchy. Story 33. It reinforces my belief that only the liberal justices are constitutional scholars. The others are not. Story 34. If the United States survives in anything like its current form, there will have to be a great undoing of all the Supreme Court rulings, executive orders, and related actions. Story 35. The entire point of the intense battle in the last election was to make it the final election. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris were truthful when they said democracy was on the ballot. Certainly was, and it did not receive enough votes. It is not solely former President Donald Trump. Trump was convenient and had the charisma and magnetism among certain subsets of American culture to get the job done, but the real work is being done by those behind the scenes. The plan was to win, then use the power of the executive and legislative branches to effectively hobble the judicial branch, and then usher in a new era where no more members of the Democratic Party would be elected. This is not a dictatorship of a single individual. It will be a dictatorship of a single party, aiming to transform the nation into something different, likely much closer to its original 1800s roots. They were honest about it. Trump said, "Vote now and you will never need to vote again. Were you not paying attention? Project 2025 is not a conspiracy. It is a clearly written and publicly available policy roadmap that was never hidden. We keep acting shocked with every new event, from executive orders to Supreme Court of the United States decisions and more, but we should not be. The nation voted for this, and we are all receiving what we have coming." Story 36. It is odd that they accepted nationwide injunctions when it was to stop President Biden from relieving student loan debt or nearly anything he tried to do. You would almost think the 6 Republican-appointed justices have a double standard. Story 37. I think the Supreme Court knows that Donald Trump is attempting to consolidate all power under himself and they are enabling him. I believe the Supreme Court is fooling itself if it thinks it can retain relevance by submitting to Donald Trump. Any one of them is just as likely to be removed as any of us, probably even more so if Donald Trump sees them as a threat to his power. Story 38. The Grand Quantum Party is trying to establish a Christo-fascist ethnostate, and if we do not stop them, they are going to kill everyone they can get away with. Story 39. No kings, that is my thought. Time for a second demonstration. How about a general strike this time? Story 40. It just means the Department of Justice is going to have to find a lot of lawyers because there will be an onslaught of lawsuits against this administration. Story 41. It means the dictatorship of capital is consolidating its power and preparing for stronger measures. Story 42. Note that nationwide class action lawsuits are still allowed, but take more effort and time to implement. Story 43. You are in serious trouble. The president initiated trade wars with multiple countries, started actual conflicts in the Middle East and actions against his own citizens, and turned his back on a country that is being invaded. That does not sound like the United States of America, I know. Story 44. For a case like this, it is a bad ruling. Until the merits are fully decided, anyone in a state that does not challenge the executive order and obtain an injunction who is not a citizen and has a child will not receive citizenship for that child. What happens after this period? When the case is decided and the executive order is deemed unconstitutional. This is why the nationwide injunction in this matter makes sense and should be put in place. No other argument is needed. The default should be to preserve the status quo and protect people's constitutional rights until all the merits are decided. This approach is both correct and conservative. The judges labeled as conservative are radicals. Story 45. There will be many newborn citizens deported because babies are not capable of assembling a competent team of immigration lawyers on short notice. Story 46. We are progressing rapidly from the United States to Hungary. It is over. I do not see anything that will stop us from living under a full dictatorship in 2 years, probably sooner. It was a good run, but democracy requires work, interest, and engagement. 1/3 of the country did not vote, so we failed because of laziness. Story 47. The Supreme Court is just a group of bought and paid for puppets. They are a disgrace to this country and should be removed. Their blatant rulings against our Constitution are horrifying and completely corrupt. Story 48. The president can take 10 minutes to write a clearly illegal executive order, but it will take much longer for the courts to respond. Story 49. If judges are not allowed to issue nationwide injunctions, the government should not be allowed to consolidate local injunctions for convenience or efficiency. Unless the Supreme Court rules that King Orange Blob cannot be questioned and strip citizens of their right to seek redress of grievances. Bondi and her corrupt crew will be very busy dealing with repetitive complaints from sea to shining sea. Story 50. A random mishmash of laws is enforced or banned depending on the court overseeing that state, complete with inconsistent enforcement. 5 feet away, just over the state line, a completely different set of laws governs what one can and cannot do. The United States is no longer united. We are now just a collection of random jurisdictions in close proximity to each other. Story 51. The ruling did not entirely prohibit national injunctions, but made it more complicated to determine when their use is appropriate. It is a complex issue that has come up during President Biden's administration as well, when judges have issued national injunctions against his policies. Some have expressed concerns that these injunctions are used too frequently and inappropriately. However, the way the Supreme Court addressed the matter has made it more difficult to obtain such injunctions and may slow down legal proceedings. As a result, we may see more class action lawsuits instead of individual suits or lawsuits brought by individual states. Story 52. I think you will see conservatives become extremely particular about where lawsuits are filed in federal court, along with which lawsuits get fast-tracked and which lawsuits get delayed. Story 53. I think if rational people ever take control, there will be certain leaders who try to circumvent the Constitution on sticks outside the White House if Democrats ever stop playing nice and get organized. Story 54. It is clearly the same position younger women have been in since the Dobbs decision. The state you live in determines which inalienable rights you have, until the court can decide on your specific case. Story 55. I predict the Democratic Party will not take advantage of this opportunity next time they win to temporarily put a stay on the Second Amendment during a Supreme Court recess and prove that guns are the problem. They could, but they are afraid and will not do it. Story 56. The questions asking for thoughts on these clearly fascist actions are starting to upset me. It is bad. What else could there be? Story 57. The rule of law is broken. We will never be united as a country again. There is nothing left but for the country to break apart. This is what Vladimir Putin was aiming for, and the foolish made it happen. So forget them. Story 58. There is going to be an absolute explosion of lawsuits seeking injunctions in every district. This is going to backfire spectacularly. Story 59. Wild ruling. Without nationwide injunctions, new federal rules will now affect some states while others keep them on hold. Expect a patchwork of policies and much more forum shopping until the appeals are resolved. Story 60. This means our Constitution is basically being used as toilet paper in the White House. The president can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. A thought occurred to me after reading the Supreme Court of the United States opinion and dissents earlier. The piece that stuck out was that individuals can actively sue to avoid executive order application. So only if you can afford a lawyer. Goddamn, we are in trouble. Story 61. My prediction is that Donald Trump will be allowed to get away with virtually anything, but the second a Democratic president tries far less, the Supreme Court will put a stop to it immediately. Story 62. It is us versus them now. We are not Americans anymore. We are only Democrats and Make America Great Again supporters. If I were China, I would launch the attack now. Taiwan might even agree to reunification without firing a shot. Everyone will be paying homage to China, and we will fade to insignificance like Russia. It is amazing how absolutely stupid we are to get to this point. This is what happens when a nation stands by ideology over everything else. It doomed France before and after the French Revolution. It took down Tsarist Russia, Nazi Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union. Now it is our turn, and we did it to ourselves. Great job. Story 63. It allows conservative states to do what they want, and liberal states to be manipulated by hand-picked federally appointed judges. This is not just about birthright citizenship. This is a complete restructuring of how the judicial branch works as a whole. Massive consolidation of power will have sweeping effects for every person in America. Story 64. Somehow, we need one session with the Democratic Senate majority and a Democratic president to pack the court. Increase the Supreme Court size by 3 and appoint 3 new Supreme Court justices. The Republicans will protest, but it is the only way out. Republicans prevented Obama from appointing 2 justices, then changed their rules and gave Trump 3 appointees. Let them protest, because this Supreme Court will suddenly change the presidential powers recently given to Trump as soon as a Democratic president is elected. Story 65. It sounds like we need to dissolve the Supreme Court and have no president of the United States if we are all on our own. They serve no function. Now Texas can be its own country, and anyone else can too. We can do all kinds of things, and it will be just a free-for-all. Yay! Story 66. The conservatives are very happy about it. However, once a liberal president is elected, we know that laws become meaningless, and a president can command things like a king using executive orders. I guess a liberal president can finally take their guns away using this method. Story 67. Legal action becomes even more the sport of kings, and just like with termination of pregnancy, one's universal rights depend on where they live. Story 68. Go look at some video of Frenchmen faces in the streets when they found out Adolf Hitler had taken over and there was nothing they could do. That is how I feel, tears streaming down my cheeks. Story 69. It is the right call. District judges should only have authority in their districts, not nationwide. That is what the Supreme Court of the United States is for. Story 70. I do not agree with former President Donald Trump's executive orders, and I strongly disagree with how he is using them. However, I have always felt that nationwide injunctions were a risky way to challenge them. I am disappointed that they will no longer be effective, but I am not surprised and do not fully disagree with the court's decision on this matter. It was a temporary measure. My hope is that in each of the 50 states, lawyers and activists understood it was only temporary and have been preparing plaintiff-based cases that will meet the court's new requirements. At least until the midterm elections, when we aim to have a Congress with enough votes to override vetoes and legislate effectively against policies we oppose. We are going to achieve that, right? Right? Story 71. It means either Democrats sweep midterm elections and impeach the Supreme Court of the United States as the first item on their to-do list, or give up now and welcome the theocratic fascism of the conservative right wing. Story 72. Democrats need to stop making identity politics their primary talking point and focus on issues that matter to more people. Otherwise, they will continue to fail. Saying things like, "But what about group of people I only see as helpless victims?" during any argument, instead of focusing on issues that affect large groups of people, will cause you to lose. All I see in the media from the left is guilt tripping, and it's constantly failing. They desperately want people to say things to prove they aren't racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on, instead of just focusing on issues that affect American lives. The Democratic candidate running for office in New York should be a wake-up call. They are desperately trying to get him to talk about how he should go to Israel and show his support for Jewish people. He says he is going to stay in New York and work with and help everyone, including Jewish New Yorkers. But these critics keep giving him grief about it while the other candidates play along and pretend to care about other countries when our own country needs work, with all the challenges happening here. He is talking about resisting former President Trump's overstepping with illegal immigration, and he is the most popular by a long shot. Yet these other Democrats are being completely unreasonable because they can't comprehend how a 30-something man outmaneuvered them and isn't going along with their nonsense. The same nonsense that caused Trump to win twice in the first place. I don't agree with everything this guy is saying, but if we had more Democrats like him, there would actually be a fighting chance. These critics need to get out and make room for Democratic leaders with some sense. I have never been one of those anti-old people in politics, but it is frustrating seeing Democratic boomers attempting to discredit young Democrats. I have seen this happen so often. Democrats with some sense or at least solid ideals come into the spotlight. They get attacked by other Democrats, and those with sense end up seeming centrist or even left-leaning because the nonsense is just too much. Everyone forgets they were fully liberal from the start, whether a politician or a political commentator. They all end up labeled with bad terms like racist, sexist, Nazi, and so on, simply because they have a different stance on one or a few issues. It has fractured the left completely. I see it all the time on social media. I am a black liberal myself and experience it firsthand. The most bigoted people I interact with are the modern-day far-left white activists. We have completely lost the plot. The fact that Donald Trump won the first time can be seen as enough of us didn't vote. But the second time should have been a wake-up call. He won the popular vote. He has more silent majority supporters than ever, and they remain silent because they don't want to be banned or deplatformed by people who become deranged at the notion of anyone having different ideals on certain issues. We often say religion has led to violence and hatred in history. People have replaced religion with politics. Extreme supporters worship Trump, and extreme opponents see anyone who votes differently as evil. When you delude yourself into thinking people are evil because they don't share your political and social stance, it becomes easier to justify violence against them. You convince yourselves that someone who has questions about transgender issues wants to endanger transgender people's lives, when anyone with half a brain knows that is not true. But spending years in echo chambers, hearing the media repeat it long enough, it starts to seem like reality. The more strongly you believe you cannot be brainwashed or gaslit, the easier it becomes to manipulate you. Story 73. The Democrats need to play the game and get as aggressive as they do. Start utilizing the loopholes the grand old party uses. Start charging immigration and customs enforcement with state crimes. Sue them for defamation like Gavin Newsom just did. Play dirty. There is no room for Chuck Schumers in this landscape. Story 74. A logical ruling. It does not make sense that local judges can block things nationwide like that. It also prevents abuse such as forum shopping. Story 75. Can someone explain why I can see and read all the liberal comments, but the conservative comments have a plus sign next to them that needs to be clicked before I can read them? Story 76. According to the president, we cannot give due process to immigrants because millions of court cases would take hundreds of years. However, it is now considered acceptable that 300 million Americans have to individually go to court to fight for their violated rights. This is blatant, unequal governance. Story 77. I know the left is upset right now in the context of this case, but historically nationwide injunctions have been implemented more frequently against liberal policies, such as employee-friendly laws and regulations and gun legislation. I do not want a radical court in the Fifth Circuit, which includes Texas and Louisiana, telling women in my life what they can or cannot do with their bodies in a completely different state. Story 78. Lawyers and litigants will find an innovative way to get important issues before the Supreme Court of the United States. There will not be any major changes otherwise. Story 79. Can we have one day without the United States doing something harmful to themselves or the world? Thank you. Story 80. This is happening because Republicans do not plan on ever giving up power. Does anyone really think this would be happening otherwise? They do not want these same rules to apply to a Democrat. Story 81. Slowly but surely, democracy is being dismantled before our eyes by the party of lies and odor. We will be lucky to get through the next year and a half. After that, all bets are off. Story 82. Democracy only works if the citizens monitor the people in power. Checks and balances are not enough. The people must actively watch those in power. If that means violence, then so be it. Story 83. Newt Gingrich fought long and hard to get the line-item veto passed when George Herbert Walker Bush was president. However, Bill Clinton was president when it went into effect. Republicans then appealed to the Supreme Court to have the line-item veto repealed. Similarly, Republicans support nationwide injunctions when issued by Matthew Kacsmaryk. Otherwise, nationwide injunctions are opposed. The only constant principle in the Republican Party is power. Story 84. This authoritarian dictatorship we are in will last a long time. No, there will not be any elections or course corrections. Not the kind you remember. That is not how authoritarianism works. The United States of America we knew is gone. Story 85. A lot of lawyers are going to make a lot of money. Court backlogs and successful class action suits will increase. Appeals that make it to the Supreme Court will probably fail. Individual lawsuits about birthright will be successful but available only to wealthy individuals and pro bono. And lastly, and most horrific, executive power will be indirectly cemented. Story 86. The United States was never going to survive another Donald Trump term without generational damage. If Donald Trump's approval rating slips low enough, he and his enablers will pay a price, but the institutions that created checks and balances will never be the same. You cannot rebuild quickly after something like this. Another country will step up and lead the world in the next century. Story 87. This administration will bankrupt the country solely with ridiculous and infuriating lawsuits. They are doing this purposely after securing a large amount of pro bono work from compromised firms and biased judges on benches to defend their absolute unjust actions. Story 88. It means the hypocritical members of the Republican Party cannot pick a certain judge in Texas or Louisiana to block a presidential order issued by a Democratic president. Story 89. South Carolina needs term limits. There is no excuse for elderly individuals in their 80s to be setting any kind of legal precedents. Story 90. Someone will quickly bring a class action in a district likely to be friendly to this type of plaintiff. That is, a pregnant immigrant whose child would not be a citizen under the unconstitutional executive order, and seek certification of a nationwide injunctive relief class. Story 91. Work on a plan. Where are you going to go and how will you get there? I have a good friend and coworker who is a Russian citizen and has lived in Belarus, Warsaw, and Amsterdam before coming to the United States with his American wife about 20 years ago. They are planning to leave. He says what is happening now is far scarier than what happened when Vladimir Putin came to power in the 1990s because it is happening much faster. He thinks the United States is headed for bloodshed because the sides are so violently opposed, and too many people literally do not care about anyone other than themselves. The Trump administration seems to have an iron grip on every handle of power, but most importantly the local and state police forces. That is his army. So they are headed back to St. Petersburg, and he just hopes he is too old now to be drafted, as he is over 60. Story 92. My thoughts are that if the Supreme Court is not going to uphold the Constitution, then the states should be able to leave the Union if they want to. My prediction is an eventual war. Story 93. I am confused about the decision that lower courts cannot issue nationwide injunctions. Here is my thought process. The Constitution gives the judicial branch the ability to conduct judicial reviews. If a lower court finds that a president's executive action is against the Constitution, they should be able to halt it. My reasoning is that it will impact everyone, not just the person or state that filed the lawsuit. The Constitution is the supreme law, so you cannot limit enforcement to just the party who submitted the lawsuit. Story 94. So the king can overwhelm the courts with unlimited illegal executive orders? It seems like plugging the hole is better than trying to bail out faster. Story 95. The impartial justices who follow the law and stare decisis will weigh in on every injunction that could be applied nationally and determine if it meets the criteria as desired. Story 96. Cannot wait for a Democratic president to ban all ammunition sales and watch Republicans collectively give the Pikachu face. Story 97. When George Washington was the first president of the United States, he was encouraged to become king. He was urged to remain president much longer than he did. He recognized that it was important for the executive branch to be the weakest of the three branches and that a president should not have the powers of a king. While I understand the broader argument that a low-level federal judge should not have nationwide influence, I have a greater concern with the executive branch asserting authority that should remain with the legislature. I am not referring only to Donald Trump, although his actions are the most recent and arguably the most egregious. Since Bill Clinton, we have seen executive orders become increasingly authoritarian, and I am very concerned about what a ruling like this means for the checks and balances that should be in place on the executive branch in general. Story 98. It honestly seems as if they have ruled against nationwide injunctions limiting Donald Trump. I do not doubt at all that they will rule the opposite way if a Democrat is ever elected again. This majority is not made up of ethical people. Story 99. Unrelated to this, my prediction is the Capitol building will suffer an arson attack next year that will be used as a pretext to suspend midterm elections. Story 100. I assume our expert defense teams will make a mistake and trigger a nuclear accident. Pete is drunk and incompetent. Former President Donald Trump has brain damage, according to James Carville. This could end in a needless catastrophe because they are incompetent and cruel. These are the people who have acted inappropriately toward women. Ladies, be cautious. Story 101. Does this mean that we do not have fair and equal treatment under the law? How can a federal law or executive order apply in one place but not another? Story 102. The courts were protecting Donald Trump by restraining the worst impacts of his executive actions. He is already polling below 40%. I am predicting a significant defeat in the midterm elections. Story 103. When a Democratic president takes over in 2029, they will issue an executive order banning assault weapons after the first major school shooting. Story 104. Remember that movie King Ralph where the entire royal family was gathered for a photo shoot and had that terrible mishap? They had to find a new king. Take from my statement what you will. I do not wish anything bad to happen to anyone. Just thinking about that movie or that one scene in Mars Attacks. Story 105. Wait. Okay, let's say Donald Trump has now decided that term limits are 8 years, not 4, and puts it in an executive order. Would we have to wait to have him removed until the Supreme Court says no, if they do at all? Please tell me I'm wrong, and that's not how it works, and it will never happen. I am totally okay with being the dumbest person ever. Story 106. It means there is going to be a large amount of retribution when this country finds some common sense. Story 107. This is nothing but the beginning of the culmination that has been building for a century. End-stage capitalism. Story 108. These immigration and customs enforcement personnel must be paid based on how many people they capture. I have lived in countries where such things happen. They were called dictatorships and were disapproved of by democratic nations. What has become of America, and how much more will we see unfold? Story 109. When one hand is flashing a bell repeatedly, I want to know what the other hand is doing. That has been the case since January. Flashy actions continuously, while something else is happening in the shadows. But it feels like multiple things are happening. Kind of like all those volcanoes erupting at once. Story 110. Massive confusion and even more delays to pass or stop any law. Good job, Supreme Court. This country was not broken enough already. Story 111. They realize that when all the power they are giving to Trump goes to a Democrat, but of course the current Democratic Party is weak and would just waste it. Story 112. It is the right ruling. Unfortunately, we have an unhinged president. Congress and the Supreme Court need to rein in presidential powers instead of having various federal judges make decisions. Story 113. Lawsuits will be filed across the country. More conflicting decisions by the appeals court and more Supreme Court cases will resolve the inconsistencies. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.